Welcome to Cornerstone's Walking with God equipping class. I am Brian, and with me I have Scott.
Hello.
And Matt.
Hey.
And what we're doing in this class is teaching you how to live the basic Christian life built off of the discipleship pathway that you've seen multiple times in your notes by now. And this is our third session exploring the calling category, which entails the unique roles and responsibilities that God's given you in your life. And in the first session, we talked a bit about calling, about how everyone is called, and how God has these unique roles and responsibilities on purpose in our life, and how there's more than one. It's not one big calling to rule them all. It's multiple callings that God's given you under your call to follow Jesus Christ as your Lord and your Savior. And then we touched on work and the idea of your work and the place you spend, 90%, 80% of your time during the week exerting your mental and physical energy as this place that God has called you to, and the different ways that you can honor God through your work and recognize the unique role and responsibility He's given you to love your neighbor through the work that you have. Matt and Scott, can you guys sum up the last couple of sessions?
Yeah. In the last session, we talked about family and finances.
First session. No, I got that wrong. The last session had two parts.
Yes, family and finances.
Family and finances. And when I said sessions, that's a plural. And I should not have done that.
You should have said a singular.
I should have said, can you sum up the last session?
Not plural, which you add the S for the plural.
Is there an apostrophe involved in that?
No, there's not. That's possessive. So family, when we talk about family, I feel like we can keep all that. When we talk about family, we oftentimes, there's a lot of common false views of family that are prevalent all over our world. We can see family as an inconvenience, something that can get in the way of your true life, or you can view family as an idol, something that is the summation, the ultimate, everything that is the true life. But the reality is that God commands us to view our role in our family as a calling. And He has provided in His Word biblical principles for the different roles that each of us might have in our families. And so we talked about that in the family section of our calling.
Yeah, and we also looked at how finances are a calling, right? So finances aren't simply like a problem we have to deal with or something we need or want to kind of have for our own use, but they're another distinct calling from God. What He's entrusted us with is really a stewardship from God that we are called to utilize for His glory, both through our enjoyment and through generosity to others.
And in this session, we're going to talk about the third really significant area of calling, your city. And again, we've got sort of two elements that we'll look at. First, your calling as a citizen, and then your calling as a neighbor. And we'll explore those as we go. But here's a summary of what we're going to talk about. First, we'll talk about how to understand your citizenship as a calling. And then second, how to understand your neighborhood as a calling. And then finally, scattered in there, we'll talk about biblical ways to approach each one of those things. So let's start off talking about our calling to be a citizen. Matt, can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an interesting one, and maybe an element, a kind of calling or a type of calling that we often don't think about. We think of it as just a happenstance or some sort of circumstance of life that is incidental to God being a part of it at all. And yet the reality is that nothing in our life is accidental, that God chooses every aspect of our lives as part of His plan to spread and display His glory, and that's including where we live. And so you don't live in Los Angeles on accident, and Los Angeles isn't just some random spot on a map. It's a city full of people who are made in God's image. It's a city that has a story. It's a city that we have an opportunity to be a part of the story that is happening here. And when God places us in a city, it's not accidental. It's not incidental. It's not random, even though it might feel like that to us in some ways from our perspective. It's with a purpose. And so we're called to be good citizens of Los Angeles. That's part of what it means to be faithful Christians here. We're called to be good citizens here. And I think there's a lot of false views that can come from thinking about the location that we live. And I would say probably the most prevalent false view of citizenship that is really common, not just in Los Angeles, but probably anywhere, although we do see it a lot here, is the idea of viewing where we live from a consumeristic perspective. It's easy for us to view where we live as a consumer. And many people will come to Los Angeles really to get something from the city, not to give something to the city. and that's their primary motivation. You know, you can come to enjoy the weather, or maybe you're here to get an education or to get a better job. Maybe you're pursuing a particular dream that can only come true here in Los Angeles. But the reality is, when we think of ourselves as consumers, our posture towards the city around us and towards the people around us who are part of that city is we try to take what the city has to offer and get whatever we can out of it, squeeze whatever we can out of it. We tend to complain a lot about the things we have to put up with in the city. Think about density, think about traffic, you think about people, right? The people that who live in the city. And then when we don't get what we want from the city, we leave because we don't really care about it. In that sense, this consumer mindset is really using the city rather than serving the city.
And Matt just gave us some examples, but have you guys seen the different ways people experience this in your life? Any practical examples to flesh this out?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all experience that to some degree, right? I think we're all kind of somewhere on the continuum of being here for the sake of blessing this city and being here for the sake of using the city. And then I think I see people struggle with it in all sorts of different ways. And really I think this has less to do with how long people are here and less to do with even what makes it possible for them to be here or what brought them here in the first place, but really has to do with how they're here, how they live when they're here. And I think we can either live here as an engaged citizen who cares intimately about our neighbors, and we're going to talk about neighbors in a second, but cares intimately about our community. It knows what our community is, it knows the dynamics of it. It seeks to engage in it for its good, or we can simply be here to, like Matt said, to use it. And I think in my own life, I feel like I've seen myself engage in it in both ways, right? So sometimes just kind of as a glorified tourist, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm just here for the things that are nice, and man, all the things that get in the way, and man, being able to get down to the beach is amazing, but the traffic and all the people that are there, like, what the heck,
Don't they know this beach is just for me?
Right. Like, I mean, that's how my heart can feel at times. But at other times, I think I can see in very real senses where you see the people on the way to the beach, the people that you're walking by at the museum, the people you're engaging with at your workplace or at the coffee shop, or like as real people that you have an opportunity every day to bless, both in micro ways, like in just little conversations, little interactions, and also in larger scale ways as you get informed about what's going on in your city, about the things that are so many people, even in a large sense, are struggling with, and contribute to being a part of the solution and to bless people and care for people as well. And so, I mean, I think we all experience that to different degrees, but we, in our flesh, tend to gravitate towards just using a city. And God is calling us out of that, I think, fleshly response to a more others-focused, others-centered, engaged citizenship.
Let's talk about that, Matt. How should we view our citizenship if we're not just consumers?
Yeah, Scott mentioned it, but I think the word that stands out is, instead of viewing the city from the perspective of a consumer, the word that comes to mind is as a contributor. That if we're called to spread and display God's glory in this city, in Los Angeles, then we must find ways to contribute, find ways to represent Christ by serving our city instead of taking from it. I think about Jeremiah 29, and we could probably do 10 podcasts just on the context of Jeremiah 29 alone, and the fact that the people of Israel have been taken out of Israel and brought into exile in Babylon, and all of the things that means about God's promises and the pain and suffering that the people of God are going through and people of Israel are going through. And they're taken to this foreign land, and this is the command that God gives them in Jeremiah 29. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. So they're pulled out of their home. They're sent to Babylon, this horrible place that has overtaken them. And he's going to give them commands for how they're supposed to live their life in this foreign land. And he says, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. So God sends Israel into exile in Babylon as a punishment for sin, and yet he calls his people while they're there. What does faithfulness look like? What does it mean to be a follower of God, a follower of Yahweh in this foreign land, in the midst of their greatest enemy? What does it mean to do? What are we supposed to do? And he says, seek the welfare of the city. In other words, God asks his people to be good citizens, those who give to their city instead of taking from it. Those who don't have a consumeristic mindset, but a contributor's mindset that says, how can I serve this city? So our calling as citizens of Los Angeles is to seek the welfare of our city as well.
Well, let's spend some time exploring that. Like, what does it look like exactly to seek the welfare of Los Angeles?
Yeah, I mean, I think it means a number of different things, but kind of like I intimated, I think it begins with being cognizant of the fact that you are here called to love others in your small little interactions, right? Like you can love the city through interacting with the checkout person at the grocery store with grace, right? With enjoyment and not just kind of staring at your phone or begrudging the long line. At the same time, it also takes place in some larger scale ways. I think it means being an informed citizen, being an informed voter, being someone who's engaged in, I mean, one of the big things that's just such a crisis and such a debate in our city is, the development of housing. Right. And part of that reason is because most of the citizens of our city don't want they're like, we need more housing, but not anywhere near me. Right. So what does it look like to seek the welfare of the city as a whole, and not just by forming an opinion, as you read an LA Times article, but like by being actually engaged in some of the things that are going on in your community, in your neighborhood, and in your city. I mean, those are just, I think, both micro and macro. There's a lot in between, but just a couple of different ways you can be engaged.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's often completely overlooked as we think about our callings as Christians, is the engagement on a local level. What's going on in my city? Am I informed? Am I voting for local elections? Am I engaged in thinking about how to better the city? I think, there's a million ways that this affects us. I think it affects even just how we think about the city. Like, as you think about Los Angeles, do you think positive things or do you think critical things? Do you think of ways, do you actively engage your mind to think of ways that you can help improve the city? Or are you just sitting back complaining about all the things you don't like about it? I think complaining, like when you see in your heart complaining, you know that your posture towards the city is not maybe what it should be, and is being undermined. Your view of citizenship, you're viewing the city more as a consumer. But even in this Jeremiah 29 verse, also praying for the city, right? God commands his people to pray for the city and pray for the welfare of the city, praying for the leaders of the city. I mean, when was the last time you prayed for the mayor of Los Angeles? When was the last time you prayed for maybe the mayor of Culver City or whatever, wherever you live? When was the last time you prayed for the county officials, right? When was the last time you prayed for school board, and other people? When was the last time you lifted up the leaders on a local level to the Lord and asked that God would give them wisdom and guidance? Maybe even, I think, also like exploring different parts of the city and being willing to learn about the history of the city. All of those things are, do you know anything about the history of your neighborhood or the history of Los Angeles as a whole? Like, do you know anything? Do you care to know? Now, it's not about whether you know or not, but do you even care? Would you want to know? Are you curious? Do you love Los Angeles enough to want to know where it's come from, where it's going, who's leading it, and ask God to bless them? All of those things are indications of your heart's posture towards the community that you live.
I mean, I think in that same vein, like you can seek the welfare of the city by becoming a Dodger fan.
Yeah, you should be a Dodger fan. If you're not a Dodger fan, if you're cheering for any other team, any other sports team, you're not. I don't know.
Okay. All right, we went too far.
We crossed the line. These podcasts always are too much. No, but in that sense, there's also an understanding of loving the things that the city loves. So yeah, I mean, is it hard for you to cheer for a sports team just because you're from somewhere else? Are you actually engaged enough to, I don't want to say you have to cheer for the Dodgers, but are you at least excited for your city when something good happens to it, right?
What are the things that help cultivate that perspective? I think for a lot of people, this is somewhat new, and complaining comes real easy. How do you cultivate this way of looking at the city in sort of more practical daily ways? What are some ways people can actually move forward in this, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a variety of things. Like I said, one of the things I think is really helpful and good for our people is, as Christians, is to explore different parts of the city. I think actually one of the things that is maybe not done enough and can be really just give you a different perspective is walk through different neighborhoods. I mean, that seems like so small.
That's exactly what I was just going to say.
Were you going to say that?
Totally.
Okay.
So just like point.
Walking. I mean, I don't know. There's something about being on the ground and something about like just walking through neighborhoods, taking bike rides, just being on the ground. We experience the Los Angeles so often through the veneer of a car window or a bus window or something like that, or a train window, a metro window. But just walking through different neighborhoods, eating at different restaurants, not going back to the same places over and over again. Always, you can go back to the same places, but
no, there's nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that.
No,
there's nothing. In fact, building relationships. That's
cool.
part of the.
That's cool.
I think we even didn't we say that in the mission category. You should go back to the same places over and over again. Go back to the same places and go everywhere else. You need a large, budget to eat out and stuff. But no, just exploring different things. I also think it's really helpful to talk to people who grew up here. If you're a transplant, talk to people who grew up in Los Angeles. There's people in our church who grew up in Los Angeles. Talk to them. Ask them what LA was like before things have changed in the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years. What was it like in the 90s? What was it like in the 80s? There's people here who've been here for 70 years. What was it like in the 50s? I don't know. There's questions to ask and people to ask who've been here a long time. Learn about the city and help cultivate a love for the city.
I think those are just such great thoughts, because I think you're exactly right. And I'm afraid that when we think about cultivating a love for the city, it seems a little bit like extra biblical. Like that's kind of like beyond what Scripture tells us to do. But just like the church is really like what the church is the people of God. Like what the city really is people, and you're right. I mean, without the people, the cities don't exist, right? They don't like spring up, grow, naturally on their own. And really, I think what you're getting at is that to engender this kind of heart, this kind of love for this city, it begins with just being willing to see people. And not thinking of the city simply as a city, not thinking of the traffic simply as all the cars in your way, but to see the person inside, the people inside every car, the people in line with you, the people at the restaurant, the people that you otherwise pass by, the people that it's so, I think, culturally acceptable in our city to ignore. And we, I mean, in our city, it's not just culturally acceptable to ignore people you don't want to look at. Like, it's culturally acceptable to ignore everybody, regardless of their station or status. And I think it begins with fighting through that, seeing the exposing the cultural acceptance that there is to both ignore others and to complain about and use the city, and to strive to see the people that make up the city.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think just like a family, like a city has a story made up of different people, and we all appreciate the stories of where people came from and where they're going. And when you understand that our city has a story full of different people at different times and places, and all those people are important and bear the image of God, I think it draws you into it a little more than thinking about it as just an amassing of traffic and, smog and things you don't like. There's a really human story here in Los Angeles. And the more you know it, the more you look for it, and the more you see, I think, the image of God in people, and understand how loving the city is loving your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. So, well, let's move on then to our calling as a neighbor. Now, obviously, the first question is, how is this different than our calling as a citizen? Like, how do we think of these two things, and what does it mean to talk about the category of neighbor?
They're not even close at all. They're not even similar in any way. I'm kidding. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap here, right? Like, but they're not exactly the same thing, because there's a reality to the fact that your role as a citizen makes you a citizen of the city of Los Angeles, and there's a broad, overarching view of your posture towards the city as a whole and its institutions, its people and its institutions. But as a neighbor, it's about specific people in your life that you are around geographically, people in your neighborhood. And Jesus is clear that we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves. And it applies to all people in a broad sense, but it definitely applies to our literal neighbors. And God has placed us not just in the city of Los Angeles, but he's also placed us in the specific neighborhood, on the specific street, in the specific apartment complex, or wherever we are. He's placed us there on purpose. And our neighbors are around us, all around us. And you can think of it like concentric circles, right? Like, yeah, the guy over in Alhambra is your neighbor in this broad collective that is Los Angeles. But the person right next door is literally your neighbor, and God calls you to love your neighbor. And you can think of it in the concentric circles kind of way. But there's a lot of common false views of neighbors as well. And I think probably the most common in a dense city like Los Angeles is viewing our neighbors as a nuisance. Whether it's the neighbor above you in the apartment complex above you who likes to play drums at 11:30 p.m. when you have to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get to work.
I mean, that's annoying.
It is annoying. There's no doubt.
Okay. I just want to jump over the thing.
Or someone who has 4 kids and a Suburban driving by you and taking up a parking spot, making it hard for your Prius to fit.
Also annoying.
Yeah. That's true. But it's easy to view the specific people and their scenarios and the scenarios you find yourself in with them as a nuisance more than anything. The best case scenario is that our neighbors don't bother us. But more often than not, it's easy for us to view neighbors as people who get in the way of our enjoyment of life. And so I think it's easy to think of really the people around us first and foremost as obstacles. Even if they are doing something that's genuinely annoying, sort of the first and primary view of those people as annoying or a nuisance, rather than anything else, I think is the common false view of our neighborhood and our neighbors.
It's almost like that's their primary identity in your head.
In our head,
Yeah.
It's no longer Bob, who lives upstairs and who is
11:30 can do some annoying
whatever,
things.
and is made in the image of God.
Yeah.
He is the guy who plays drums at 11:30 p.m. and that's why he drives me crazy, and he represents everything evil in the world.
Yeah.
It is funny how quickly it gets to a place where when you say it out loud, you'd be embarrassed or very guilty. But at some point, the knee-jerk reaction is like, that person is doing that annoying thing. I wish they just didn't exist. Like, I wish they didn't exist in this place at this time.
Like, if they stopped existing, I wouldn't care. In fact, I would be happy.
Yeah, and again, you say that out loud, and it sounds so crass and horrible. And yet, I think if you have a decently introspective posture throughout any given day when someone annoys you, that's not like part of your family. Like that idea of popping out of existence is something that really makes you realize how much we don't think of them as having annoying behaviors. We think of them as being nuisances. Their identity is something that we want to not be.
And when Brian says say it out loud, he doesn't mean type it on the internet, because I think if you typed it on the internet, you also wouldn't feel that bad about typing it on the internet. It's just when you say it verbally out loud that it
things have gotten
sounds
weird.
bad.
Yeah.
It sounds really bad.
Okay, so clearly we've seen this at work in our own heart and the hearts of other people. Any other examples you think we should touch on to help people kind of grasp how this works? That's a no. That's a no.
I mean,
head
there's
was
so many.
I was
so
totally,
many.
I was totally running off. My head was in a whole other direction.
I mean, like I always
sorry.
talk about the people. I always talk about people who leave dog poop.
That's right, yeah.
On your yard or whatever, and there's when you're surrounded by people, there's an infinite amount of ways that they can annoy you.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of it depends on your posture through life, right? Like when you're not seeing people, what really all you're seeing is nuisances, right? When you're not looking to understand and see people, like, then it's not like there's a few nuisances out there. Like, everybody becomes a nuisance. I mean, have you ever like felt this? I mean, I know I've like, you know, whether it's in my life or, you know, I've seen it in my life, I've seen it in my friend's life, where like you walk through a day and just everybody, like it's like everybody's in your way, right? The other drivers are idiots. The, you know, people in line can't get their coupons right. Like the, you know, the person at the smog station, like, you know, doesn't go quick enough.
The smog station, huh?
The smog station. Isn't that a...
We know what Scott did last weekend.
Smog check.
Smog check.
Smog
place.
check station.
Yeah, it's a thing.
Right? Okay. But I think that there's... When we see the people that way, all of a sudden, like, almost everybody becomes that way, and except for the very small number of people that are helping us, right? Are like doing exactly what we want them to
But
do.
even then, I think what you've got is this sense. It really runs deep because there's the sense that everyone begins to exist for you, and that's why Matt says best case scenario they don't annoy you. Like best case scenario they don't make you upset.
Yeah.
Because at some point their existence is predicated on doing what you want them to do when you want them to do it.
Yeah.
And in a weird way, like even with the people that are making you happy, the reason they're making you happy at that point is because they are doing the thing that you want them to do when you want them to do it. It's a really selfish way to kind of approach life in the world. But like you said earlier, in a city, there's a way that because of the density, we sort of give ourselves a pass on looking at other human beings this way. And you see it manifest in these various states of annoyance you find yourself in things that really should be just annoying. You know, well, someone did something annoying, which is not a shocker. They shouldn't be. They have sort of defied my will as the center of the universe, and therefore my day is ruined, and it's all their fault.
And they deserve my wrath.
Yeah.
I mean, you see, it's the natural outflow of being in a city. When you're in a city as a consumer, when you're you're in a city to use the city, then you really are in the city just to, like, if the city's just the people, you're in the city to use the people, and either they fulfill the use you have for them, or they get in the way. And so I think naturally, when we're in a city to use the city, then the people in the city are really nothing more than either helping us or they're nuisances. And those are the only two options.
Yeah, I think that's a good connection. And so then clearly this runs pretty deep. So how should we be viewing our calling as a neighbor?
Well, I know it's shocking to hear, but God calls us to view our neighbors as neighbors.
That's deep.
Yeah.
That's deep.
That's the solution. That's what he says. He says, love your neighbor, treat them as a neighbor. And what it means to be neighborly is, instead of getting annoyed at every one of their quirks or every little thing that they do that gets in our way, is to seeing them as a human being made in the image of God who needs to be loved, and we're called to, by God, love them. We're called to invest in them. We're called to care about them. We're called to not just ignore them or treat them like something that gets in our way, but to understand that part of the reason why God has us here at all is to represent the love of Christ to them, even when they are being annoying for one reason or another, or not, and to see them as part of our calling rather than something that gets in the way of what we really want life to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's the second greatest commandment, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. And I think it takes that bent that we tend to have inward on ourselves, kind of looking out for ourselves in our interaction with everyone else, and it says, oh, wait, how do I treat you with that kind of concern? Where I'm not just being nice to you, I'm not just being polite to you, but I'm actually, instead of looking out for me, I'm looking out for you. I'm going to love my neighbor as myself.
So clearly that word neighbor shows up in the Bible fairly regularly and in some pretty important places. So it's worth taking some time to explore how the Bible would have us treat our neighbors, like sort of a sense of, if we're to look at them as neighbors, then how does the Bible guide us in how we should treat them? So Scott, can you talk us through some of those?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with recognizing that really everyone and anyone in need is your neighbor. I mean, this is when Jesus said that the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And as he taught that, people tried to wiggle out of it then, just like we try to wiggle out of it now, right? We're just like, oh, like I okay, I guess I should try to do that. But, and, one lawyer asked him, and this isn't, nothing against lawyers, but actually the best thing about lawyers is they ask good questions, right? And this is exactly what he's doing. He's like, get specific. Who is my neighbor, right? How do you define that? How do I figure out who my neighbor is? And Jesus answered him with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Right? And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, and we're not going to walk all the way through it, but essentially what he was saying was, look, anyone you come across who's in need, that's your neighbor. And so there's, it can be your literal neighbor, the person who lives in the apartment next to you, the person who lives in the house next to you. Or it could be somebody at the store. It could be somebody at school. It could be, your neighbor is the people that God places in your life that you come across each day. And so, there's really, when we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves, there's not a category of these people who are our neighbors who we need to apply that to. And then there's the other people, kind of the non-neighbors, which I think is actually it's how we can tend to live a lot of life, especially in a crowded city, right? I always feel like the parable of the Good Samaritan is great, but like there was only one guy that was hurting on the side of the road, right? Like what happens when there's like 100? Well, that's why he's placed all of us here to like just reach out and love somebody. And to the extent that we can, love and care for them, to the extent that we can, the next person we come across, to reach out and love them. And so in a sense, we see that Jesus is calling us. He's telling us that our neighbor is anyone we come across that's in need. And so in that way, everyone we come across is our neighbor.
Yeah, it's good. But I think, Matt, you would want to add another layer to these principles in terms of the idea that there are some neighbors that are just sort of immediately around us. There's tons and tons and tons. And in those concentric circles, there's also some people that seem like they would be specifically in need in ways that we as Christians would be called to love them.
Yeah, the Bible has a term to describe this. Bible talks about those who are marginalized or those who are oppressed. And there's a reality to the fact that oftentimes people in our cities and people in our communities, people who are our neighbors that are most in need, are not necessarily the people that we regularly would interact with on a daily basis. And so there's something to be said about this kind of active posture of a neighbor that says, I'm going to love the people that God puts in my path, and I'm also going to go out of my way to make sure that I'm loving and caring for people in my city and my community that are in need, that are in need in ways that I won't be able to see them regularly. And so, you think about Exodus 22, that God commands the people of Israel as they go into the promised land that you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you are sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. There's this posture of compassion for those who are in a place of social lack of privilege, in a place of a lack of social capital. And there's a lot of people in a city, in our context, who can fit into that context or fit into that category. Isaiah 1 talks about learning to do good and seeking justice, correcting oppression, bringing justice to the fatherless, and pleading the widow's cause. And in ancient Israel, these are the people with the least amount of power in their society, the least amount of ability to have resources and to be able to take care of themselves. A fatherless child is a child that has no one advocating for them, is a child that in ancient Israel doesn't have a lot of opportunities, doesn't have a lot of chance. No one's taking care of them. No one's concerned for them. No one's providing or reaching out to them. And they might be hidden, in a place where people wouldn't see. You'd have to go and seek that out. The same is true in James chapter 1 in the New Testament. It's not just an Old Testament ethic. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And so, yes, everyone's our neighbor and we're called to love our neighbors. And yet I think there's a unique calling as well as Christians to be neighborly to those who are most in need in our society. And there might be poor, homeless, abused, oppressed, or more. And God's word is clear that we're called to be a voice for the voiceless in our neighborhood and beyond. And that's obviously a huge category to think about as we consider our role and our calling as neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly true. And I think it goes back to it is demonstrated in the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Because the religious leaders that did not help, they're kind of given as the example of what not to do, didn't only walk past and not do anything, but he walked to the other side of the street, right? He walked to the other side of the road. And what the Good Samaritan did was he stayed on his side of the road so that when he saw him in a distance, he knew he was going to have to walk right up to him. Instead of seeing him in a distance and then crossing to the other side of the road so that you kind of didn't have to come across him in your path.
You have some plausible deniability.
Yeah.
Oh,
at
I
the
kind
very
of saw him, but he's on the other side.
But I think that's what we all do, even in our city, right? And you're like, oh, well, I don't come across needs. Like, I don't see them all the time. Like, I keep walking through my life, and they're not there. But there's parts of our city that are in significant need. You know that there's systems in our city that are in significant need, whether it's the school system or the prison system or the foster care system. Like you know there's these systems where there's significant need. You know there's parts of our city, even geographically, where there's significant need. And I think oftentimes we spend most of our life avoiding them, right? Like walking to the other side of the street so that we can stay kind of in our lane. And then we're like, oh, well, but I don't come across them at all. But that's because even if very subtly, the truth is we're avoiding them.
And I think maybe another thing in this arena that makes this hard is, okay, everyone's our neighbor. And we live in a city or a county of 10 million people. And lots of people are marginalized and lots of people are hurting. And so a question comes up is, okay, well, when it's one person on the side of the road, yeah, sure. But when you're talking about millions of people hurting, I can't do everything. And so there's this, I think there's this place we all come to where we just say, well, I can't fix homelessness. Whatever, someone else will have to fix it. And I think that's really a sad place for us to be as Christians in this city. And then the other response would be, well, then I'll just give $5 to this homeless person. And I understand the heart behind that. But I don't think those are the only two options: to give up completely or to just try to give some cash as you see people in need along the way. This is one of the reasons, and kind of moving into the question of practicality. What does it look like practically? This is one of the reasons why we as a church partner with organizations. And I know it's maybe not as flashy or as like glory for us as a church that we're doing this. We, Cornerstone West LA, have solved the homelessness problem. Like it would be much flashier, and we would receive a lot more glory if we did that. But the reality is that the problems in our city are so complicated and so complex and so multi-layered that we as a small church in West LA are not going to be on our own able to fix all these problems. But there are great organizations out there that we can partner with that are tackling these issues from a systemic and a broad level, things that we can't even see, issues that we can't even see. You and I in our daily lives most likely are not going to see the foster care crisis in Los Angeles County. We're not. Because kids in foster care don't have special T-shirts, and because we're not engaged with families on that level, we don't always hang out in schools, and we're not social workers. Some of you are, who are listening to this. But this is why we work with organizations that do see that need and can show us ways that we can help in the midst of these kinds of crises. Homelessness is that way. Complex, social, convoluted, multi-layered. We can solve and care for people as they struggle through and experience homelessness. But we're not going to solve it on our own. There are organizations that are working towards dealing with this. We partner with a great organization called Imagine LA, for example, that partners faith communities with families that are on the street experiencing homelessness. And what that does is it provides us specialized people who are social workers who can help them get into housing and other things that have access to resources that we don't always know about. But we provide budget coaching and support for relational support and tutoring. We help them get moved in. And we've done this for a few families already and helped homeless families. Now, we weren't the only ones. Imagine LA did tons of work on that. But we helped multiple homeless families go from living on the street to living in a sustainable lifestyle. And that's way more now. That's way different than just giving $5 to a homeless person, but the impact is felt way more broadly than just a short-term thing. So these are more strategic and comprehensive and thought-provoking strategies that allow us to tackle the issues in a practical way by partnering with organizations that are handling so many things that we can't handle.
And I think that it's, for a lot of us, it's meant to be like a both and, right? And not just a both and like hand somebody $5, but like a both and like I want to be involved through these organizations, and I need eyes to see the needs that are the marginalized needs that are around me. And when I do see them, when I do hear about them, I mean, if you're a part of our church, you hear about needs in our city.
You should.
But I'm going to choose not to look away.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to choose not to walk to the other side of the street, but to stay in this lane and ask the Lord, okay, Lord, I can't do everything. I can't solve it all, but what do you want me to do? And I think sometimes that's through one of these partner organizations that help facilitate that. And sometimes the answer is very personal and very relational because we quickly see needs that maybe we hadn't even seen before.
Yeah, we have, just to give a sense of the breadth of what we have going on here, we have people who work and serve those who are experiencing homelessness as social workers, and we have people who every Tuesday night go out and feed people who are experiencing homelessness with real food and a hot meal and prayer down at 3rd Street Promenade. So both of those things. One is very personal, direct, relational. One is very systemic, behind the scenes. We have people who are loving and caring for families in their community group that maybe have foster kids in their family, and then we have people who are CASAs, who are advocates for foster kids in the system, and we have people who are social workers, and we have foster families and families who are bringing in foster kids, and people who are adopting. We have a heart and a passion there. We have people who love and maybe send money to support organizations that care for refugees, and we have people who are hosting refugees in our church, and we have people who love and serve refugees in our community. We have people who love and care for and partner with organizations that serve undocumented immigrants. And then we also have people, I was just talking to one of our law students who was going down to the border to help undocumented immigrants or people at the border apply for asylum in the United States. That's crazy. So we want to encourage both, absolutely, and give people a perspective that says if you're going to be living in Los Angeles as a faithful Christian, God has called you to be neighborly to the immediate neighbors around you. And we've talked about that in a variety of ways. And also those who are hurting that maybe you don't even see in our city, in our community, in our neighborhoods. And there's ways that we can help facilitate that for you.
And I think when we see that from the perspective of God's kingdom, right, everything that he is doing and how he's knitting us together and how he's knitting us everything together, he's called us to be a part. That removes the pressure, right? Because you or I or anyone listening doesn't have to do all those things. Nobody can do all those things. You're not supposed to do all those things. You're not even supposed to try. And when you do try, you get burned out and exhausted because you can't. You're not God. You're not a savior. But you are called, and you're called to be a citizen in our city and a neighbor to those around you. And I think as we walk through each day, just simply asking, okay, Lord, how can I live out my calling as a citizen and a neighbor is the simple question that he puts before each one of us.
And talk to us, and we would love to help you facilitate that.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're talking about, walking in the world, spreading and displaying God's glory in our lives. And that means walking in these various callings and seeking to love others in our city and in our neighborhood. And here's what we talked about. We talked about how to understand your citizenship as a calling, and then how to understand your neighborhood as a calling, and tried to provide biblical ways and practical ways to approach each one of those things. And here are some practical questions for you leaving this session. First, what are some ways you can live out your calling as a citizen this week? And then second, what are some ways you can live out your calling as a neighbor this week? We encourage you to pursue those, and we will see you for our next session.